Welcome to another speaker series event brought to you by the Cultural Knowledge Consortium. The CKC is a joint interagency effort of the U.S. government to support the development of sociocultural knowledge and facilitate knowledge exchange across a range of sociocultural communities of interest. Contact information, the CKC blog, discussion forums, and other resources are available on the CKC web portal at ckc.army.mil. You will also find a link to recordings of all speaker series presentations on the CKC YouTube channel. You may submit questions using the chat, question and answer pod in the lower portion of your screen at any time. We'll respond to as many as time allows. Content of this presentation should not be construed as advocacy, nor representing the views of the CKC or the U.S. government. This presentation is unclassified and intended for public release. Enjoy this presentation.
And good afternoon, good morning everybody, depending on which time zone you're in. This is Jay Hunt, CKC Operations. I'd like to welcome you to another speaker series event brought to you by the Cultural Knowledge Consortium. Today's guest is Dr. Margaret Hawthorne, and she comes to us from the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk, where she is an adjunct research faculty member. She has kind of an interesting background. She helped establish and present the curriculum for the Institute for the Study and Practice of Leadership at Washburn University in Topeka, not too far from here, and also served with NATO forces in Afghanistan. Also developed and trained deploying social scientists, those that are deploying with military forces, and most recently, and the most pertinent to the discussion today, is Dr. Hawthorne spent time in Turkey, where she taught university classes on in the English language and on American culture and probably the peculiarities thereof. Today is a little bit of flipping around of that, where we're going to be speaking mostly to Americanites about the culture of Turkey and some of its paradoxes. So without any further ado, I'm sorry, the one thing we want to have you do is please at any time, if you have questions, enter them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We're going to get to as many of those as time allows, but go ahead and enter them in there and we'll stack them up. So if you could please do that, fantastic. I'm getting some word that I'm having some audio issues. Thanks everybody. I'll try to minimize that. So without any further ado and without any further popping, I'd like to introduce our guest and welcome Dr. Margaret Hawthorne. Thank you very much, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay, for that kind introduction, and I'd like to thank the consortium for inviting me, as well as extending to me immense patience in putting up with my constant delays of this project. This morning, I'd like to discuss with you some observations and really calls for further research, and referring to the title, some paradoxes that I observed in Turkish culture, specifically in the city of Çannakale. The tentative answers to some of those questions about the study of culture, I think, lie in how we approach the word paradox. It's nearly ubiquitous in recent literature, secondary literature about Turkey, and it's, of course, easily observable on the ground. I'd also like to use the processes of globalization as a backdrop here. Today, those processes in Turkey are, for better and worse, associated mostly with Western ideas, and quite often American versions of those ideas. Some markers of global change processes are positively received. Things like cell phones and cars are, of course, embraced by large segments of the population. Other less readily definable components, such as secular democracy, for example, have been simultaneously blamed or praised for things, depending on your perspective. I hope to point out some of the paradoxes of Turkish culture by considering some of my own perceptions of Turkish understandings of and responses to some processes involved with globalization. Secondly, I hope that this discussion will emphasize the need for greater and more nuanced attention to Turkish groups and individuals who are experiencing the processes of cultural redefinition on local and global scales. This is my favorite slide. I spent 3 months in Çannakale from mid-January to mid-April of 2013. There I was teaching and doing what I will call preliminary research, looking for one topic that I could then continue to pursue. Quotes and we'll call them stories and examples that I use here are, of course, from things that I either participated in or was present. I was given written, informed consent to use them all. Except in a few cases when it's obvious, one cannot assume that the gender pronouns that I've used here correspond to the gender of the person in the actual real life. The observations and conclusions are, for what they're worth, my own. Down in the left corner, you can actually see the city of Çannakale. It's a city of about 106,000 people. It's located on the Dardanelles. You can see, standing on the beach, you can see Gallipoli from across the water. Control of this area has been contested throughout ancient as well as modern history. The Ottomans, in order to kind of cement their control, built 2 castles on either side of the straits there in 1462. The region's importance in the First World War is well known. Here's a view from the top of the largest hill, the University Hill no less, looking down at Çannakale. Based upon conversations and observation, most of the visitors to Çannakale these days are on their way to Gallipoli or somewhere else. Shopping and entertainment options are fairly limited, especially during the relatively mild winter months when I was there. There is the large public university in town. It's Çannakale Onsekkiz Mart Üniversitesi, also Çannakale 18 March University is its name. I will refer to it here as Çomu. It's atop the hill, and it looks down on the town. It's too obvious an opportunity for a picture not to miss. Here's the flip side of that view. The university was founded in 1992. Boasts roughly 1,500 faculty and about 37,000 students. It's named for a battle that took place on 18 March 1915, which launched the main attack of the Gallipoli campaign, in which the Ottoman Empire was victorious, and the future career of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk, was cemented. Gallipoli, or Gelibolu, was always near the top of people's must-see lists, but a second top attraction was a bit of a surprise to me. Along the Cordon, the seaside walk in town, there's a huge version of the mythological Trojan Horse. The actual site of Troy is about 18.5 miles from Çannakale. The wooden horse in question was a gift to the city from Warner Brothers and Brad Pitt after the filming of Troy in 2004. Only through internet research did I find out that the movie was actually filmed in Malta and in Mexico. The university itself does not seem to attract many visitors. One reason could be that armed guards prevent all but registered guests from entering. As an American culture and English conversation instructor, I engaged with students as well as faculty. Of course, I also interacted with people about the town, in shops, on the buses, restaurants, at the university hotel where I lived, anywhere and everywhere. In one instance, I spent a lovely afternoon gathering shells with a group of students on the beach. It turns out they were school children. They spoke better English than did their teacher. On other occasions, I spoke with individuals whose entire family spoke English, but they never spoke it at home, nor were they teaching it to their children. The majority of the time, I used my broken Turkish and considered it a real win when I was able to get on the bus and actually tell the driver where I wanted to go and not make him impatient because he didn't have any clue what I was trying to tell him. One of the major points that I'd like to make about Çannakale is this. It's a small city. It's struggling to carve out an identity for itself, as are its inhabitants, both individually and collectively. This remark is often made about the entire nation of Turkey. However, its applicability and the specifics of that application have yet to be researched on a large scale. For today, I've limited myself to 5 broad topics or themes. Some of them will illustrate more than one point. All of them point to needs for further research. So much the better as far as I'm concerned. There are some very important ideas, or even sometimes dichotomies, that must be reconsidered if they're to be applied, especially by Americans, to Turks. The definitions of these terms are muddled enough in the United States and may seem even more so in Turkey. In short, there is such a thing as a liberal who is a woman and wears a headscarf in Turkey. Some of those covered young women sat in my classes or on benches around campus and in town beside their boyfriends. They held hands with them in public. On the other hand, there are women in government-appointed leadership positions who think it is, quote, wrong for a woman to not like to cook, end quote. Interestingly, this woman got that notion from American films. An example of an ultra-conservative in Turkey could be a strong ultra-nationalist with ties to the military, as well as fierce loyalty to the secularist principles of Atatürk. In the Turkish university system, the rectors are appointed by the country's president, sometimes in contravention of university elections. Some professors do not feel that they have the freedom to teach the courses, let alone the material that they deem appropriate. In one case, a professor left a job in order to take a position at a, quote, more liberal, quote, university. This professor was responsible for several survey courses in philosophy, but the university only approved the Islamic portions and perspectives of the syllabus. Students commented throughout the 3 months that I was there that they were neither allowed nor trained to think critically. Outside of class, they added that this was the government's fault, but failed to elaborate. Critical thought in the form of questioning and or challenging authority is viewed not only as bad behavior, but, as in the case of many Turkish journalists, can be dangerous. The traditional conservative military elite views the appearance of a covered female in public as a threat to their secular vision of the state. Whether the woman chooses or is forced to cover is not relevant in that perspective. Conservative Muslim females do not all cover themselves in Turkey, and many liberal people in Turkey think and feel that the choice of clothing should be just that, a choice. On Fridays in my classes, when the afternoon call to prayer came, my students and I were always quiet as one young man stood, bowed to me, and asked permission to be excused. Now, throughout all of our classes, we discussed the practice of Islam and its variations. We discussed religion in general. Everyone, no exceptions, was eager to offer an opinion or to agree or disagree with friends, classmates, even me. They felt no reticence about pelting me with questions not only about American culture, but about religion in America. Those students who proclaimed themselves atheists met with no more reaction than did the young man who left to pray, which is to say very little. Even though Çannakale is on the western coast of Turkey and would seem to fall into the so-called and often applied liberal West category, this is not often the case. There are, for example, still tea shops in and around Çannakale that women do not visit. Others have a petition to separate the men from the families. Of course, these also exist in more cosmopolitan areas, but women from Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir told me that they would not hesitate to stop or had already stopped in these traditionally segregated shops when passing through small towns, especially if no other option was available. When asked, no women from Çannakale had ever been to an all-male tea shop. I went in quite a few of them, but always in the company of Turkish male friends, and always the "she's a foreigner, she doesn't know" rule applied. In my case, this rule, so named by my Turkish friends, was applied with a bit of a wink. I asked my friends about the propriety of my presence in these tea shops, and they all took great pleasure in both explaining the system as well as using me as a way to beat it. I still have mixed feelings about that. In the case of the Turkish military, the terms liberal and conservative must be approached carefully and in context. The military has always seen itself as the guardian of the Kemalist ideals of a modern, secular state based upon equality among Turkish citizens. However, as these terms, like globalization itself, become more contested, so do the claims of those calling themselves Kemalists, promoters of democracy, and true Turks. In 1960, 71, 80, and 97, the Turkish military intervened in Turkish politics to correct perceived leadership failings, especially with regard to the presence of religion in the public sphere and the Kemalist legacy. Now their powers have been curtailed as Prime Minister Erdogan and the conservative, democratic, yet increasingly Islamist Justice and Development Party, or AKP, have continued to chip away at that legacy, and as a further goal, to bring the military closer to civilian control. One soldier told me, for example, "I am an Atatürk soldier, but I am afraid. I just do my job." The young men in my class all knew of the requirement to serve their country, but none were willing to discuss it. A 2012 survey found that 70% of respondents think that mandatory service should remain in the new Constitution. Yet, there is also a new idea out there. The remaining 30% of respondents favor a transition to a professional military or options for conscientious objectors, such as social service, instead of compulsory service for all males. And civil-military relations in Turkey is not only a fascinating subject, but for some obvious reasons, very little explored. Equally underrepresented in some of the recent literature is not just the historical, but a continuous tracing of relationships between Muslims and Christians. When I visited the town of Assos, which is about 54 miles from Çannakale, I had a very interesting experience. My Turkish friend and I were in the process of removing our shoes before entering this old mosque that you see before you here, which used to be an even older church. I had a scarf, but she didn't. However, a Turkish man approached us after hearing our conversation and told us that we didn't need to cover our heads because there was no one around. Once inside, my friend was genuinely and acutely embarrassed by the destruction of the Christian legacy inside the building. You see some of the markings here that are still visible on the walls as a result of some restoration efforts. This led me to think that maybe all of Turkey right now can be considered a vast remodeling effort, but neither the architects, the builders, nor even the inhabitants have agreed upon the final outcome. This is the Turkish student oath that you see. The young school children recite this. The last phrase, the "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene," how happy is one who says, "I am a Turk," or "I am Turkish," was added in 1997 after the last postmodern coup. My experience with it, personally, was one more of inclusion rather than exclusion, and we'll circle back to that. I didn't have many opportunities to actually interact with children. The few interactions I did have were quite enjoyable and usually encouraged by their parents. Often groups of school children came to the beach near my hotel. They were anxious to show off their English skills or take whatever shells I would give them. The 10-year-old daughter of some of my friends was one of the best Turkish tutors that I had while visiting. Both of their parents spoke English, and she was studying it in school. In contrast, many of the staff at the hotel where I stayed were quite pleased with my efforts to learn Turkish, but said that it was just way too late for them to learn English. They ranged in age from early 20s to the 50s, but none had attended university. The exception was the young staff at the reception desk. All of them were students from the tourism and travel department of the university, and they spoke some English. Of course, speaking English is not the only, or maybe not even the best indicator of a good education, but in Turkey, that ability does seem to make one more upwardly mobile. In order to get a PhD, one must pass an English exam. In order to graduate from many departments, one faces the same requirement. This exam consists of multiple choice questions. There is no speaking component or listening component, a fact that both students and faculty criticized in my conversation classes. The key to success on this particular exam is the memorization and application of grammar rules. This approach to language learning may also explain why some graduate students and faculty kept requesting a book for my conversation class. Similarly, in Afghanistan, I encountered the same thing when I tutored Turkish officers in conversational English. Several of my students in Çannakale had to drop out of the class because their doctoral exams were nearing, and in their opinion, a conversation class was of no use to them. Unfortunately, they did have a point. Students and faculty with whom I spoke were all critical of the higher education system, off the record. In class, if in the hearing of those who might be in a position to affect their advancement, they towed the line. The main criticisms were aimed at the lack of critical thinking and too much governmental and administrative intervention. My bolder students often enjoyed joking, ironically as well as sarcastically, that they knew English grammar rules better than I did, even if they couldn't speak English. The issue of self-confidence is one of Prime Minister Erdogan's favorite themes, and it's relevant here, I think. Fear of public failure is a potentially insidious characteristic of my experience both with the Turkish military and the Turkish university system, and Turkish people in general, really. In theory, my conversation classes were open to anyone, but in practice, they were only for the faculty. When I met with undergraduates, I simply took over some already existing classes for a few times a week. I was told that the faculty members were too advanced in their skills to be in the same class with undergraduates, yet there were certainly faculty members whose abilities were below those of my undergraduates. In some cases, some of those in need were even members of the English faculty. To say I don't know in response to a question from a colleague was, in my experience, often more damaging than to make the same response to younger students who, on more than one occasion, were awed by the fact that I would admit, the key word there, ignorance. Yet, their respect for me didn't diminish in any ways that I could perceive. This is definitely an area in which we need some more nuanced understanding in order to be able to interact more effectively. The curriculum in Turkish schools has attracted some, but not nearly enough critical attention recently. Religious education, its form and duration, as well as the nature of student participation, is hotly contested in Turkey these days. Even Turkish history itself is being assaulted or rediscovered, depending upon perspective. Issues of inclusiveness and exclusiveness are central to the debate. For example, a student who is deemed Turkish could then lose the rights that could or should accrue to that person by virtue of being member of an ethnic minority. The most recent democratization packages from the AKP are as yet only promising. The willingness to confront only one sanctioned interpretation of the past is an issue that requires attention not only from those within a culture, but those on the outside who would increase their understanding. In August of 2013, 1.8 million students took the Transition to Higher Education exam, competing for approximately 530,000 seats at universities. The Turkish population right now stands at about 75 I've seen estimates as high as 80 million. The really startling fact here is that roughly 40% of the Turkish population is under the age of 25. Another source says that 50% is under the age of 30. And this should only serve to heighten the urgency, I think, to really understand the culture. All of these people, however old they are going to need jobs and stuff. The recent works in Turkey, with the exception of a very, very few, were all published before the events of this summer, the protests almost throughout the country. And they point to another trend here that's fairly easily noticed, but again, little researched. And that is the shift away from Kemalism toward something else. One something else that has been pointed out is perhaps a shift toward a glorified Ottoman version of the past. But this Ottoman version also focuses upon the more liberal conditions under which Turks engaged in business and trade relations with non-Turkish peoples. The rise of an Islamic middle class, which was based largely in the conservative Anatolian region, has also provided a lot of economic leverage for once marginalized groups, including women who would wear a headscarf in the urban centers of Turkey. They choose a conservative lifestyle, but they desire clothes to accommodate both their morality and their sense of style. Islamic fashion is a booming business in Turkey and Çannakale. Mobile phone stores are a ubiquitous feature on the main streets and side streets in Çannakale as well as larger cities. It seems that everyone item. Yet the demand for and presence of, especially Apple products, is astounding. The most common way to get these things is, I don't know, through a friend who comes to Turkey and brings them in her luggage, or in the duty-free shops of airports. In order to compete, a Turkish cell phone company has recently announced its own smartphone that will be similar, they say, to the iPhone. Electronics aside, Turkish stuff is quite cheap compared to prices in the United States. This includes things like salon services, where a manicure costs about $10, clothing. I bought a pair of fashion jeans for about $37. Food is quite affordable, both in the grocery store and in restaurants. Public transportation costs about 1.5 Turkish liras, then about 77 cents for a short trip, 2 Turkish liras, just over $1, for longer trips. This is my bus card. Bus cards are easy to obtain there and easy to recharge. The high price of gasoline is deterring more and more people from actually acquiring cars. Cost-wise, the preferred mode of travel from Çannakale to any of the larger cities was the bus. The few trains that do exist do not come to Çannakale. There's a small airport there that closed for remodeling right after I was able to use it to get back from Ankara. That saved me about a 10-hour bus ride, what would have been about a 6-hour ride in a car. Small buses don't offer much in the way of flexible travel schedules. Sometimes I spent as much as 90 minutes a day, if my classes went over, which they often did, waiting for buses. Rather than wait, I usually just went on an excursion somewhere. At other times, I definitely saw it as time wasted, and Turkish people are beginning to see things the same way. I interpreted this as evidence of increasing individualism. Interestingly, if the university felt it important for me to arrive somewhere on time, they sent a government car and a driver for me. My students all longed for the day when they would own cars and be in charge of their own comings and goings. When I met friends in town, I would take the only bus that came out to my hotel to the grocery store that you saw in the previous slide. That grocery store was just outside the city center. From there, my friends would come pick me up so that I wouldn't have to waste time waiting for and changing buses, and they wouldn't have to spend extra money for gas to come get me. From there, we would go shopping and out to eat, two favorite pastimes of Turkish people just about everywhere. Um, there's very little variation in men's clothing in Çannakale. Jeans, khakis, slacks were prevalent with weather-appropriate t-shirts, sweaters, the occasional hoodies. Guys do wear longer shorts in the summer for sports. Long hair is more of a statement among men. Male university administrators wore suits, as did my drivers, while other professors wore everything from jeans to suits. There's much greater variety and meaning attached to women's clothing. There were women wearing all black, fitted coats, overskirts, with scarves covering all but their faces. Women in long skirts and colored coats, scarves, loose pants, long blouses, all manner of combinations. Otherwise, they opted for basic Western clothing, tight jeans, shorter skirts, sweaters, blouses, high heels, and boots. Whatever the choice, there was usually an emphasis on style and trendy fashion items like purses, shoes, and scarves. Between the two extremes, there were older women in the traditional baggy shalwar pants with sweaters and scarves, but very few of the older women in the long robes and the coats. While there may be certain conclusions that are safe about the women in black, there's insufficient evidence at this point to support the assumption that conservatives or liberals wear certain clothes in Çannakale. Again, it may seem that I've fallen here into a bit of stereotyping, but from a cultural or perspective, it's impossible not to notice what people are wearing. Furthermore, and more importantly, I think, the scarf issue here is really emblematic of a larger and as yet to be clearly understood set of divisions in Turkey. Because up until recently, women university students could not cover their heads in public universities. Now they can. Yet, the fear among some people is that the pendulum is swinging toward a reinforcement of more traditional dress codes. Fear itself is a common sentiment among some parents when speaking about their daughters' futures. Modest dress, limited access to alcohol, and families of at least 3 children are among the current Turkish Prime Minister's wishes. 76% of participants in another survey think that anyone should be able to wear a headscarf anywhere. Again, an indicator that the scarf itself is probably not the real problem. Encouragingly, and perhaps a bit unexpectedly, one of the anticipated features of Prime Minister Erdogan's latest democratization package is a ban on any restrictions on any apparel worn in public. In general, yes, this is another famous bridge in Istanbul. Turkish people are smaller than Americans, both vertically and horizontally. However, there's one effect of globalization, or perhaps Americanization, that is rapidly changing this fact. Among students and the 30-somethings, fast food is gaining in popularity. Pudgy children and muffin tops among younger women and men are far more prevalent than I would have ever expected. Fast food is something of a guilty pleasure for Turkish people. They love it, but hate that they do so. Turkish women do not exercise outside or in public to the extent that women in more westernized countries do. Many of those to whom I spoke don't exercise at all, especially if they're married. In Çannakale, I was the only person to use the tennis court or to run on the track. There were a few walkers if the weather was nice, and as spring approached, young men would play soccer. Having embraced so few of the culinary aspects of globalization, Turkish people were always surprised to find out that Americans, however few of us, might know and actually like Turkish coffee or baklava or any of their other dishes. The fact that some of us could even make it was cause for open-mouthed astonishment. This reaction stems from a widely held Turkish idea that I spent 3 months trying to dispel. That is, that there is no such thing as real American food. This idea is based, again, only on something I suspect. In Turkey, American food is basically fast food, as opposed to, say, a French restaurant or a Chinese restaurant. People tell stories of visiting America and being taken to all sorts of international restaurants, but never eating American food. Americans may be rediscovering our pride in our regional and ethnic cuisines, but the Turks don't know about it. When they go to a restaurant, it's usually a Turkish restaurant because it's famous for something Turkish, and they love their Turkish food. There has been more change also in the realm of the famous Turkish etiquette and politeness. My impression of the extreme politeness and deference of Turkish people was met with definite approval from friends and acquaintances. To suggest otherwise would have been quite rude, actually. Fellow teachers, however, were also a bit surprised, which made me wonder if perhaps there's a common culture of professors and teachers worldwide, because off the record, the consensus among faculty was that most students were lazy, had a poor work ethic, and were always late, even that they were, quote, on Turkish time, end quote. A far more common complaint came from women and men about the behavior of young people on buses. Now, this had nothing to do with kissing, holding hands, or even snuggling. The grievance stems from the refusal or failure of youngsters, especially young men, to give up their seats for their elders, male or female. I once caused a young man to get popped on his head by an elder female because after what I deemed an indecent interval, I played my foreigner card, stood up, and offered my seat to an elderly gentleman. Before he could finish graciously accepting, the red-faced young man had been popped and stepped forward to tap my shoulder to offer his seat to me. I told this story to my friends, expecting them to find it funny. But that's when I discovered that they had all had similar experiences and deplored the rudeness of, quote, today's youth. Again, from secondary literature and my own observations, Turkey, as well as Çannakale, is struggling to make a lot of decisions right now. One concerns whether to be a leader, a mediator, or, again, some other role in the world and in their region. A comparative leadership study that I began while in Afghanistan confirms this. There does not seem to be any consensus regarding whom Turkey will lead, in what, and on whose terms. Geography has either placed Turkey in an ideal, enviable spot or cursed it with an uncomfortable straddling position. The Turkish people, while fiercely loyal to the memory of Atatürk and the idea of a motherland, remain divided regarding the true nature of that history and the memory and who can be considered part of the fold. In the last few weeks prior to this presentation, I also noted a shift in the tone of some articles, with some even suggesting that the Kemalist era is over. Nonetheless, political parties and individuals, regardless of their leanings, claim to be defenders of true democracy in Turkey. A professor in Çannakale, who identified as being moderate and tolerant of most people and beliefs, told me that he really didn't know what the Kurds wanted. They're always unhappy. That last was a quote. Another professor stated that the issue really didn't affect her. These two comments were both uttered after some Turkish students stabbed a Kurdish student for, as best I can piece together, brandishing some inappropriate and forbidden, quotes, literature about the rights of Kurds. This event took place at Çomu, but was quickly hushed up. None of my students mentioned it, nor did I mention it to them. A university official was absent for 2 days to try to talk to the Kurdish students, but ended the discussion and the affair by concluding that they, the Turkish students, quote, would not listen. That official further insisted that it was important to be seen trying to talk to them anyway. Politics are important to Turkish people, especially those over the age of 30. Men especially over the age of 30. There's a large social aspect to it. As people attend meetings, rallies, they choose their newspapers accordingly as well, not unlike people here in the U.S. Yet there's another shift underway. Despite social and cultural, even spousal admonitions to not discuss it, men would usually ask me whether I was a Democrat or a Republican or if I had voted for Obama within minutes of having met me. Sometimes their wives would shush them. Nearly always, the women would feign or actually be bored if the discussion continued in a political vein. I attributed this attitude to the limited roles available for women in Turkish politics, as well as current popular versions of the ideal Turkish woman that serve to reinforce those limitations. Politics also are important to the younger sets in Turkey, but the current system doesn't allow them the kind of outlets they seek either. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to say that issues and values, as opposed to the current form of politics, are more important to younger people in Turkey generally, and women in particular. Many of my former students, not to mention a few of my academic colleagues, participated in the recent protests in Turkey. They sent me pictures, articles, Facebook posts, and emails. Interestingly, I believe that Turkey has the 4th largest presence on Facebook. Some of them wanted Prime Minister Erdogan to step down. Others simply cited capriciousness, abuse of power, extremism, Islam or otherwise, a desire for democracy among their reasons for protesting. Another young officer stated that he's afraid. Yet another told me in writing that soldiers are not allowed to put their views in writing, but that I could easily guess hers. Okay? During the height of the protests, one student kept me apprised of an angle that was missing from most of the coverage. That is, the thoughts and feelings of an Erdogan supporter. For example, he informed me that 100,000 people showed up at the airport in Ankara to greet the Prime Minister upon his return trip from a trip to Africa. Now, I thought maybe this seemed a little high, and he was having trouble with his numbers, since we were chatting in English. So I asked again, and he insisted and wrote the number out. Now, Turkish news sources reported only thousands to tens of thousands. His perceptions, however, are reflected by others in Turkey and supported by some secondary literature or from talking to protesters. This particular group of perceptions reflect loyalty to Erdogan and a suspicion that Turkey is being held back, especially by the United States. They think that Erdogan should have taken a tougher stance against the protesters, and they view the United States as also not just holding Turkey back, but interfering, and this is based on rampant anti-Islamic sentiment in the United States. Furthermore, they feel that, especially the younger people, that they are not allowed to live their lives freely as Muslims in Turkey. This person also indicated a lack of friends at the university, only in Istanbul. He condemned Turks who don't pray regularly, who do drink alcohol, and fail to observe Ramadan fasting, yet completely agrees with all of his classmates in wishing that there could be, quote, peace, and that everyone could be together, end quote. There is a deep-seated and historically based tendency in Turkey to blame problems on conspiracies, both within the country and outside of the country. People from both sides of the aisle, for example, have decided that the EU, the European Union, may not be the panacea that it once was. Objections, fear from, again, conspiracies against Muslims, anti-Muslim discrimination, to a loss of national independence or self-determination. Ritual politeness aside, however, attitudes in Çannakale in general towards the U.S. were positive. People were happy to find that Americans were visiting their town, sometimes even surprised. Yet, many Turks are reluctant to leave their homeland, especially for the United States. For many of the younger students, it's a question of finances. They do want to study abroad. With the advent of the EU Erasmus exchange program, in which Turkey participates, the younger generation hopes to at least afford a trip to Europe and England, if not the United States. The 30-somethings are a bit torn. They love their country. I cannot emphasize that enough. Yet many of them feel deep guilt for using words like hate or describing their regime as a fascist one, which they want to escape rather than staying at home and trying to change it. These are the young professionals that have very little faith in the Turkish political system and its constitution, the current one or the soon-to-be new one. And again, I must emphasize that 40% of Turkey's population is under the age of 25. Nobody can afford to ignore so large a slice of the demographic pie. In the interest of time here, I'm going to skip forward a bit to one final story that I hope may pull things together for you. The days preceding the 18th of March, the anniversary of the battle, were marked by excitement everywhere, as well as enhanced security in Çannakale. The university hotel where I stayed was full. Decorations were going up all over the place. These consisted mostly of Atatürk portraits and immense Turkish flags. Students were buzzing about the concerts that were being held all week long by famous rock stars, Turkish rock stars. This was also a big deal to me, anyway, because Prime Minister Erdogan was going to be speaking at the festivities. Here you see the inside of a grocery store, as well as one of the university buildings on top of the hill. During the week preceding his visit, I started to ask my friends about their plans for the following holiday, the following Monday. Some of the cooler guys had no intention of being caught at the Mustafa Ceceli concert. They teased their friends whose girlfriends were making them go. None of them had any plans to go and listen to the Prime Minister. We talked about such appearances at American universities, and I said that things were a little different because we really didn't have quite this kind of celebration at our schools. How, they asked, did universities mark such important national dates? I asked among my colleagues. Some of them said they were going, others just planned to take the holiday. Then I found out something disappointing. My supervisor informed me that there was no holiday because she had received no official word to the contrary. So, when I arrived at school on Monday morning, the place was deserted. I was not surprised, however, I was irritated. I will admit that. No one came to any of my classes. My supervisor was not there either. By the time I got a bus down the hill, it was too late. The next day, when an official asked me if I had been to the speech, I could only express my deep regrets and apologies and offer the excuse that I had had to work. He was both puzzled and disappointed in me. To this day, the best explanation that I can offer is, well, really not one. Maybe somebody wanted me to have a good time at the concerts or not see the Prime Minister. That's a bit conspiratorial. Or maybe the officials didn't want to be seen giving in to demands for holidays. Maybe there's just something I don't understand about Turkish university policy. My students all told me about their picnics and how they had slept late that day. Their pictures were plastered all over Facebook. Obviously, they did not go see the Prime Minister. No one with whom I was acquainted had actually gone to the speech. When I told my friends about this, they laughed. You know, it's funny now. But they were equally puzzled as to why I was told to go to work. I still feel as though I missed out on something, both event-wise and culturally. But I don't think my Turkish friends understand why I feel that way. All I know is that my expectations regarding what I thought everyone should have been doing on such a national holiday caused me to miss a call here. In conclusion, it has dawned on me that the word paradox is, as I started in the introduction, quite important. It's a way for us to look at culture without necessarily giving a value judgment. No one wants to have his or her arguments labeled as contradictory. To state that a culture is riddled with contradictions conjures thoughts of, at best, a failure to think something through, and, at worst, even unethical intent. My Turkish friends and colleagues became angry if a colleague characterized their words and actions as such. I also noticed that pointing out contradictions in someone else, be it individual, group, or country, is not only rude, it's a favored tactic, especially if you're on the defensive. Because of the often voiced statements of devotion and loyalty to some idea of Turkey, I expected people to demonstrate this loyalty by attending Prime Minister Erdogan's speech. I saw a contradiction instead of a paradox. Thank you very much for your attention. I have here
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Meg Hawthorne.
Resources that are available to you.
Folks, again, I apologize for some of the sound quality, and I even got kicked off. The DCO system that we write on here is having some issues this morning, so forgive us on that, and we really do appreciate your patience. While we're waiting, and I encourage everybody to go ahead and enter your questions in the chat box down below, I have a couple things that keyed up in my mind as you were speaking. The first one, you mentioned something about an ideal Turkish woman. Now, I wasn't quite sure if that was your characterization or maybe how they view themselves, or maybe the self that they wish to project. Could you give me a few more details?
Sure. In fact, in my paper, I have it actually in quotes, and it's all of the above. There's a book that I couldn't even get my hands on yet. It's so recent, about the ideal of Turkish beauty. Gentlemen do prefer blondes in Turkey, which causes a lot of Turkish women to be conflicted, as well as dye their hair. And that's just the surface. If you really to someone from outside the culture and to some components inside. Most of my female friends definitely noted it. Now, we did not discuss that in class for reasons that I think should be obvious, but my older friends, yes. Some men also found it a bit inappropriate. Then when you take to the other side, things like, well, women should not wear skirts. There was a recent protest where young men took to the streets wearing skirts in support of their female fellow students. The ideal woman is, again, she is lovely. She supports her husband. She definitely works a double shift. Feminism is not quite a word there yet. Women's rights, on the other hand, it's still kind of in that stage as far as democracy, and there seems to me to be a great deal of tokenism as opposed to genuine earning of positions by females. For example, there are a lot of female rectors, female vice rectors in Turkey, in the university system.
That seems strange, and some of these things, it seems very much that there's a management of perceptions and labels. And Carl Prinzel writes in, how does one actually define their labels? How does one define conservative versus liberal? Is it based on politics, religious beliefs, practices, economic philosophies, or is it really dependent on the context and the people to whom they want to project this image?
Again, an excellent question, which I would love to right now, without being there, to actually write the article that says, here are the labels as they currently are accurate. would just be astounding, because to even start with conservative and liberal, the first thing you have to do is basically flip-flop them as far as the way we're used to thinking about them. But even then, I mentioned, no, a liberal can be the female who covers her head, whereas the staunch secularist is also going to be a conservative. Why? Because they also want to keep Turkey for the Turks. The strong military attachment. Do not want government interference. In fact, the military is used to it that way. Again, I think we're in the middle of a shift right now. And I think that's one reason. So, again, I talk to a very small group of people, but so many of them say things like, well, I don't know anymore. I don't know what is happening. I don't know what's going to happen. So many people are afraid and nervous. They all work hard because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. One of the things I cut out in the interest of time is one of the so-called happiness surveys. And Turks really are not all that happy. It's based on kind of quality of life things. Yeah, context is, of course, important if you're looking at culture. But by the same token, if everybody supports true democracy, wait, does that sound familiar? If everyone supports democracy, then they've got to do a bit of defining, and I hesitate to do that defining for them yet.
That seems like a bit of a insurmountable task, or like trying to pin Jello to the wall. This shift that you speak about, how do you see that shaking out over the next 10 years or so?
Well, it does seem to me that Turkey is becoming more, I'm going to say, conservative. On some levels, it's becoming more democratic, but it's becoming more conservative, more democratic in the sense that the economy has grown. Turkey is largely a middle-class country. They couldn't say that. In fact, Erdogan will pretty much take responsibility for that, and the AKP has done a lot with regard to bettering people's positions. This population boom, especially in young people, I really do think it is cause for, if not alarm, great attention. When you've got that many people already, competing for university seats, jobs, resources, you combine that with the fact that Erdogan would like for a good Turkish woman, and well, family, but woman, to have at least 3 children. I worry about. Well, all right. Let me back up. I worry about the definition of democracy. It's a part of a larger study that's, of course, ongoing right now. Is the relationship between Islam and democracy.
In this ongoing shift, the struggle, and the perceptions, Turkey's always been the crossroads of the world. And do you see this becoming, in that specific struggle, do you see it becoming more of an open conduit, or is it going to be a roadblock that leverages their position in the region?
Do I see which, the democracy or their position?
This change, this movement.
Okay. No, I'm sorry. I just misunderstood part of the question. A lot of it depends, again, and I guess this also goes back to your next 10 years, on what Erdogan decides to do. I mean, a lot of things have kind of backfired on him recently. But for example, the EU. On the one hand, it's not completely false to call it a Protestant club or a westernized club. On the other hand, Turkey, a lot of people in Turkey have said, we don't need it, we don't want it, etc. But the people in the Middle East have said, well, why do we need you, Turkey, if you don't join the EU? What else can you offer us if you don't have that way into whether it's markets or other forms of power in the EU? So there is the possibility that Turkey/Erdogan may shoot themselves in the foot. And we have seen through the protests and the violence this summer and the reactions to those protests that perhaps the pendulum that had gone one way may start to come back towards the center.
Do you see this this almost a hesitancy to be aligned with the EU and maintain their Turkishness? That's probably the wrong word for that. Do you see this as part of this? You spoke about the Ottoman version of the past. Is this romanticized version of the past, is that a problem, or is that what really holds them together?
Well, Turkishness, yes. Yes. Turkishness is something that could also be a wonderful study, because like democracy, wherever people stand and whichever way they lean, they are and want to be called Turkish. The romanticized Ottoman version, sure, it's better to include the more versions of one's history you have. I mean, Afghanistan has just wiped the so-called troubled times from their history books. So you have an interesting issue there. I'm sorry, I lost it when I went off on the tangent about Afghanistan. Please, please, can you bring me back on track, please?
The romanticized Ottoman past.
There's a great soap opera that illustrates that issue. It's called The Magnificent Century. Well, Erdogan hates it. He tried to ban it. It has been banned on Turkish airline flights because it shows not only romanticized but sexualized version of basically the harem and the palace power politics. Now, there's still noble Turkishness involved, but it's basically beautiful costumes and beautiful people all trying to see who, if you're the women, who gets to sleep with the Sultan, and if you're the men, you know, who he's going to sleep with and whose head he's going to chop off next. Now, again, Erdogan hates it because it's fiction. The costumes are all wrong, admittedly. There's a lot that's chronologically wrong. We've never seen that before, right? So I asked everybody about that. Some people were embarrassed about that very show, that it even existed. A lot of men just said, that's just fiction for housewives. Others just said, it's entertaining. Who cares? So you had the whole spectrum. Context. I don't know, but as far as who doesn't romanticize their history? Atatürk is equally romanticized. There were great things that came from the Ottoman Empire, just as there were from Atatürk. It is, in fact, a crime to insult the memory of Atatürk. So, to condemn people for romanticizing their history is something I can't quite do yet. I can point out that it is done. And if it leads to a greater sense of inclusiveness, as opposed to simply burning the books that have it the other way, then I'd say go for it. But don't ban the soap opera.
Yeah, we got to have our soaps. Here's an interesting question put in here by Doug Batts from NGA. He says, conspiracy theories flourish in Turkey like nowhere else. And it got me thinking, is this because there are more conspiracy theories, or is this some kind of a cultural conversation sport, like a status thing to show how insightful or how...
Well, as I said in my paper, it is not only observable, and obviously Mr. Batson has observed it, it's historically based. I mean, it goes way back. So clearly the answer to the cultural part has to be yes. Now, some of these theories are quite, let's say, creative. You just want to look at and say, really? But some of them are, on the other hand, they are deeply held beliefs. The fact that the outsider, the other, if we want to go the theory realm, is possibly a threat. And that has certainly been the case in Turkey before. So I think you have to say culturally, yes. To show status, that's interesting. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, and one last question. Is there an increase in Islamic militantism in Turkey? And if so, what is the society's position on it?
Wow. Again, an excellent question, and one that I will not claim expertise in. I would definitely say that Islamist presence has increased. Militantism, I don't know. I mentioned that there are many Muslims in Turkey who feel that they cannot live their lives freely. I mean, the word freedom here, everybody is using the word freedom. It's not a bad word. I was just amazed that all sides of the spectrum, all parts of the spectrum. Militantism, perhaps, probably depends on, again, things like ethnicity, sectarianism. There are groups in Turkey, of course, who are feeling really, threatened, and have been for a long time, depending on where they stand in that map. Let's see. There. I had a backup slide. There are the orange is your Kurdish majority areas. Most of the protesters this summer, among the group of protesters, there were people, in fact, let me back up and say both sides, the anti-protester group and the anti-government group, both tried their best to show pictures of women in headscarves, to say that the other side was not respecting freedom. Perhaps it's just militantism in general that is on the rise, as people espouse values and ideals because the political system seem to be failing them.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And just to kind of close out our session here, again, I want to thank you. And what's the one big takeaway that we can have from your presentation?
Well, I would love for everybody to write their takeaway to me. My big takeaway is kind of the reason for writing it here is that there's a lot that's easy to look at on the surface and say, Turkish culture is this, Turkish culture is that. You can do that the same in any culture. But I think that Turkey is more important than perhaps the average Turkish person does as far as world politics. I think it remains for Turkish people and outsiders to actually do the more research or do whatever it takes to kind of understand the processes that are going on and the reactions to, and maybe come up with some of those labels that, I apologize, I forget who asked, but maybe we need some of those labels, even if they're only light sticky notes, that we can put on some things to help us understand it.